Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining part two of the Iowa Cancer Consortium's Cancer and the Environment 101 webinar series. For folks who may not be familiar with the Iowa Cancer Consortium, we are the state's comprehensive cancer coalition composed of over 650 members working across the state to advance cancer prevention and control through advocacy, equity, and collaboration. My name is Caroline Powell. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the staff lead for our new Cancer and the Environment Task Force, which started over the summer. And our goal is to better understand and communicate the potential impact that agricultural, occupational, and environmental exposures may have on the state's increasing cancer rates. And so if you joined us last week, we learned from Molly Jacobs about the environmental exposures that could lead to cancer. And so this week we'll be focusing more on the state's increasing cancer rates and factors that influence that. And so now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Mary Charlton, who is a professor of epidemiology at the University of Iowa College of Public Health and the director and principal investigator at the Iowa Cancer Registry. The Iowa Cancer Registry releases annual reports on cancer data in the state. And so the findings in this year's report, which I'm sure many folks are familiar with, were a huge reason why we started the Cancer and the Environment Task Force in the first place. So this is a really great segue from last week's presentation. And through her work, Dr. Charlton aims to educate Iowans about the trends and public health issues related to cancer prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Dr. Charlton.
Thanks, Caroline. Let me get my slides pulled up here. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to talk about this today. Let's see, can you see? It doesn't look like there. Is that in presentation mode for everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about what I have figured out, what our team at the Iowa Cancer Registry and the University of Iowa College of Public Health. It's kind of taken a village here, but I'm going to sort of lay out what we know as of today, and we're constantly doing more and more analyses to figure this out as to what is driving our higher than national average cancer rates. I will try to bring in elements that I think connect to the environment, but didn't want to talk, full disclosure, I'm not an environmental epidemiologist like Dr. Jacobs was last week. My research focuses more on improving outcomes of cancer. So what I'm an expert in is counting the cancers and finding the patterns and figuring out what populations are being impacted and what are the drivers. So I hope this talk will be sort of a call for everybody else on here who either does research or policy or advocacy or whatever to sort of take the data and if you have questions at the end or ones that we don't get time to talk about, please do reach out. We're always happy to partner with people and try and share our data in ways that will be helpful to figuring this out. But just wanted to make sure everybody knew that's what that's sort of the scope of this talk today. So I wanted to reiterate what Dr. Jacobs said last week. If you were there, she had a much simpler picture, but basically talking about how multifactorial cancer is. I found this picture, which really talks about how lifestyle or external factors then go on to contribute as risk factors for cancer. And as you can see, it's horribly complicated in the ways that it does. And each one of these lines is numerous studies to kind of figure that out. So I just kind of wanted to hit that point home that as far as we've been able to figure out, there is no smoking gun. There is no one point source causing all the cancer in Iowa. It is more kind of a mountain of pebbles, but the pebbles are all probably different sizes and we can prioritize those as a community. And for those of you who do environmental research or environmental advocacy or policy, hopefully this will sort of help give you the lay of the land of what is contributing, we think, to cancer in Iowa and where maybe your work could help us reduce the burden of cancer for Iowans. That's supposed to be me down in the bottom corner trying to figure this out. So anywho, so again, cancer is caused by changes to certain genes that alter the way our cells function. Some of these genetic changes occur naturally when DNA is replicated during the process of cell division. And, you know, if there were no other causes of death out there, if we all just lived long enough, we would all eventually die of cancer because our cells would make mistakes in the way they replicate that would eventually lead to cancer. But other cancers are the result of environmental exposures that can damage DNA. And those are a whole host, a variety of exposures that we'll get into a little bit more during the presentation. So again, there's no one single cause for cancer. It is the complex interplay of genetic, behavioral, and environmental factors that produces cancer. And simply because a substance has been designated as a carcinogen does not mean it will cause cancer. We all know people who smoked their whole lives, I think Dr. Jacobs brought up last time, and don't get cancer. So there are like other things that it has to sort of interact with in order to cause that. So just want to make sure that people kind of understand the complexity of what goes into actually causing cancer. So all that aside, how do Iowa's overall cancer rates and trends compare to other states? Most of you have probably already seen this graph showing Iowa in the yellow line on the top with the rest of the country in the gray line. And you can see that we're a little bit late to the party here in declining or decreasing our cancer rates here in the kind of 2010 to 2012 or 13 kind of time period. And then something turns here in 2013, and as the rest of the country continues to decline, albeit at a slower rate than that earlier time period, continues on average to go down while Iowa sort of takes a turn up. I put the 2020 data points on here. They're not reliable in any way, shape, or form because of the pandemic, and we just sort of hot off the presses have a 2021 time point. It does look like it is continuing to increase. So some people have asked, well, I was really fortunate to have NCI SEER registry. And what that means, the National Cancer Institute has a program called Surveillance, Epidemiology, and End Results. And they began with 9 registries back in 1973. We began collecting data in 1974, where they funded a lot. And those registries were supposed to represent the rest of the country. They've since grown that number of registries to we're going to show mostly the 17 that have been around since at least 2000, but they all have the resources that we do at Iowa. They all have the means to really be collecting and aggressively collecting cancer cases. They tend to be a little bit better resource than the CDC state-funded registries. So that was kind of the question is, are we just better and more aggressive at finding cancer cases? The answer seems pretty clear to me, no, because these are just the other NCI funded registries, and they too are going down like the rest of the country while we are going up in that time period. Also got asked, well, what about, I was an agricultural state. What about our neighbors? What do they look like? Maybe agricultural states or rural states just have higher cancer rates. So you see they do tend to have a little bit higher rates, but we are still exceeding any of our neighbors, and many of them are declining. You see in red is Nebraska. They actually have a pretty similar trend to us, but they're starting at a much lower point. I believe this is Wisconsin here that's also sort of going up, but for by and large, most of them are stable or declining, and those are all the states that we would consider neighbors. So you've also probably seen this information. We do rank number 2 in the US for age-adjusted cancer incidence rates behind Kentucky. And last year we were the only state with a statistically significant increase in incidence. This year there's a handful of other states that are increasing in the most recent 5-year time period, the 2016 to 2020 data. We rank in the top 10 for oral cavity and pharynx. We're second. 3rd in leukemia, 4th in non-Hodgkin lymphoma, 4th in esophageal cancer, 5th in melanoma, 7th in kidney cancer, 8th in colorectal cancer, 9th in breast, 11th in uterine or endometrial, 12th in bladder, 12th in brain, 14th in lung, 15th in prostate, 17th in pancreatic, 18th in thyroid. These are all a collection of very different cancers with very different risk factors. So you can see we're talking about a wide variety of risk factors and different drivers here. Also, just wanted to point out when we look by race that we are second in terms of incidence for our non-Hispanic Black population, fourth for our white population, and so forth. The good news of all of this is that Iowa ranks 21st in the US for age-adjusted cancer mortality rates, and our mortality rate is decreasing as it is in other states. So that's the good news. But the bad news is people are still having to deal with having cancer, even though we're able to cure that or keep them living for quite some time. But if we look, we still rank fairly high in mortality for cancers like ovarian, melanoma, esophageal, prostate, leukemia, brain, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, thyroid, kidney, lung, and lung. And we are third highest for cancer mortality in Black populations. So that's third out of all 50 states. We rank third highest for mortality among our Black population. So I'm just going to kind of go through our process for kind of trying to figure out what's going on here. So how do Iowa's Big Four cancer rates and trends to compare to other states? And when I say Big Four, I mean breast, prostate, lung, and colorectal. As you can see here from this graph, each bar represents a time period going back to 1973 up through 2019. The blue is cancer incidence, the red is cancer mortality. So you can see these four cancers the incidence is far greater than the others. So we kind of refer to these as the Big Four. So we wanted to know, could one of these four be driving those differences in our cancer rates? Is it just a couple of cancer sites that are really driving us to be number 2 in cancer incidence? So I've been working with Jake Olson, a biostatistician who runs the Center for Public Health Statistics here at the University of Iowa College of Public Health. Excuse me. And he started to help create some different graphs and trends and things that we can use to sort this out. So unfortunately, you can see with a breast, purple is prostate, turquoise is lung, and down here in the red is colon and rectum. And we're the circles and everybody else in the US is a triangle on average. Our circles are higher in every single one of these big four cancers. Where we're increasing at a higher increasing at a higher rate or starting from a higher place in things like breast and prostate, really kind of driving maybe an increase. And then we're declining at a lesser rate than the others in cancers like lung and colorectal cancer. So just to go over some basic facts and risk factors for these cancers. Breast cancer is about 14% of all of our cancer cases in Iowa. Again, we're ranked 9th and rising at the highest rate of all US states at a 2.5% average annual percentage change. Fortunately, we're ranked 40th in mortality and the rate is declining. We are 8th in mammogram rates. As of 2020, we're in the mid 80%. Which is great. So a lot of people, I got the question earlier today, does Iowa just screen better than other states? And so we find more cancers and then we cure them earlier, and that's why our mortality rate is low. And we do have favorable screening rates. But the issue here, I'm going to skip ahead to a slide, is here's our screening rate, and this is from a previous Cancer in Iowa report. Our screening rate is that black dotted line. And our cancer rate, incidence rate is blue, and it continues to go up here past when we get to 2021. Issue is our mammography rate is not increasing, but our cancer rate is increasing. So it seems to me that it can't be simply a detection issue if the cancer cases are going up while the screening rate is staying the same. So known risk factors for breast cancer include age, genetic mutations, reproductive history, dense breast family history, being physically inactive, being overweight or obese, taking hormones, and having your first pregnancy after age 30. That's kind of a key one where we think we see higher breast cancer incidence rates in urban areas where people tend to have higher education rates and put off having children more often until after age 30, which is why we think we see breast cancer a lot more in some of the urban areas and the rural areas. Also, alcohol and previous radiation treatment. Some possible risk factors that are listed for breast cancer are endocrine disruptors, and these can be things like PCBs, BPA, and pesticides, such as that really long word that I'm not going to attempt to say. So that's maybe the potential environmental risk factor, but it's only listed on, I think, either NCI or American Cancer Society, where I got most of these, as possible. So again, more research is needed on that. Here's our, with Iowa being in the yellow and the other SEER registries being in the blue, we're sort of tracking here what's our trend, and you can see we were kind of declining pretty well, while actually the rest of the SEER registries were increasing. And then we kind of hit this inflection point here in around 2012, and we've gone up ever since, and now we're quite a bit higher. We've certainly done some research to try and figure out if this point was wrong. Did we miss cases back then, or what was going on there? We can't find any evidence of that yet. But irrespective of that, even if this wasn't right or we missed something, we'd still be going up. Like we end up at a much higher place than the rest of the SEER registries, and that rate continues to increase. My postdoc, Jason Semprini, did some work to look, okay, well, the breast cancer is there's not just one breast cancer, there's different subtypes. And, a lot of these cancer sites really encompass sometimes, several to 100 different diseases. So want to make it clear that, that there's differences here, and we're breaking them down here by the main breast cancer subtypes, which is based on hormone receptor status and Herceptin status. And the most common type of breast cancer is the hormone receptor positive. So that'd be the ER/PR positive, HER2 negative. And as you can see, that's the one kind of driving things. And that's where you can see Iowa in the yellow. Sorry, turn that off. In the yellow is really the one that is where we stand out from the other states around us that he compared to, whereas we're kind of right spot on in the rest of the subtypes. And if we look at early versus late stage, you can see it's really, fortunately, we're not off on late incidence of late stage, but we are higher in that incidence of early stage. So the good news again is, we're catching it early, and it's a favorable subtype that we're able to treat. But the bad news again is that people are having to go through treatments like surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, which is never good. When we look at incidence patterns across the state, the purple means the higher, and the light yellow is the lowest. These are our kind of newish cancer reporting zones, where we collapsed counties with really low populations that made it so that we sometimes would have to suppress rates because they were too unstable. And we were able to split up counties that had large metropolitan kind of populations in them, so we could look more at community than the full county. You can see that breast cancer really tends to concentrate again in the more urban centers. And again, I think that's a lot of that has to do with the fact that these are the same places that are purple here, are the places with the highest education rates in the state, where women tend to have children later on in life, and that's certainly a risk factor for breast cancer. There could be a lot of other factors at play here too, but we consistently see that is one that is more common, and the incidence is higher in the urban areas of Iowa. And these are some new maps that we're working on. So, this was kind of large aggregated zones. These are down to like zip code kind of levels, and comparing earlier timeframes to later timeframes. And you can see again, there tend to be the darkest red tend to be concentrated where there's some urban populations, but not a super clear pattern other than that. Also wanted to move on to prostate cancer. That's another one that was increasing quite a bit and is a very common cancer in Iowa, again, excuse me, 14% of all cases. We're ranked 15th in Iowa, and we are rising at an average annual percent change of 3.4%. Our mortality is 12th in the nation, and our mortality rate is stable. Known risk factors for prostate cancer are age, race, family history, and genetic mutations. Possible risk factors that were listed were diet, including increased calcium intake, obesity, smoking, prostatitis, sexually transmitted diseases, vasectomy, and some chemical exposures. And they specifically mentioned Agent Orange and exposures that firefighters experience with the chemicals that they use in firefighting. And again, endocrine disruptors, and those are the ones I mentioned in association with breast cancer. And this is the trend in prostate cancer. I tried to see if like the recommendation, the changing recommendations for screening with PSA tests would sort of explain some of the trends, and they don't quite, wasn't quite as clear story as I was hoping for here. Again, you see Iowa in the yellow is actually, really mirroring the rest of the country and actually a little bit lower. And then around that same time period, that breast cancer turned around, so did prostate cancer and started to go up, and this is widening over time. It was already kind of declining when the United States Preventive Services Task Force recommended against screening men over 75 with the PSA test, and kind of a little bit more sharper when they recommended against all PSA screening. And then later on sort of issued a revision saying, talk to your doctor and do shared decision making to decide if the PSA test is right. So, PSA screen is just a blood test that a doctor can add on. I believe it was still being covered by insurance. So I don't know that there are any 100% direct correlations between these screenings and exactly what is happening here. But the rest of the country is on the increase. We just are increasing quickly. We've long seen that the highest incidence rates of prostate cancer are in Northwest Iowa. These are kind of showing the whole western part of Iowa, but we've always kind of seen in this Northwest Iowa higher rates. Prostate cancer is a tricky one because a lot of times if you look for it, if you're screening a lot for it, you will find it. And the reason that the USPSTF recommended against prostate cancer or PSA screening for a while is because sometimes the treatment was worse than the cancer, depending on a lot of different factors about individualized factors about the person. And some cancers, if you never found them, you'd never know they had them. They would die of something else, and they wouldn't have caused any trouble. So it definitely can reflect some practice patterns, but it could also reflect some different exposures and risk factors and things like that. So that one's a kind of a tricky one to tease apart sometimes. And here again are those new maps, and this really shows those highest rates in Northwest Iowa when we look by incidence by zip code. And this is using a lot of statistical methods like Bayesian methods to sort of smooth these out, because obviously rates bounce around in small areas like this. So it's borrowing from space and time. Okay, so we've talked about breast and prostate, but what if are those really driving the increase? If we remove those, are we back in line with the rest of the country? It's kind of the question. Well, the answer is no. There's still here's Iowa in the red, still kind of going up, albeit at a lesser rate than when we had breast and prostate in there. But you can see the rest of the US going down. So they did not account for the difference, although some of it, they accounted for a good part of it, but certainly not all of it. So wanted to talk about lung cancer, because that's one that's not increasing, but as I mentioned before, it's also not decreasing at the same rate as it is in the rest of the country. It accounts for 13% of our cases and almost a quarter of all of our cancer deaths in Iowa. We were ranked 14th, and the rate is declining. Mortality, we were ranked 18th, and the rate is also declining. We rank 8th, actually, which is pretty good among all states for lung cancer screening. There's an estimate that 10% of Iowans have been screened for lung cancer, which is higher than the national estimate of 6%. So we were doing better than the rest of the country, but I think we can probably all agree those are pretty dismal screening percents. Obviously, the big factors for lung cancer are tobacco and secondhand smoke, but especially in states like Iowa, radon is a huge driver. It's the #2 cause of lung cancer, and it's the #1 cause in people who don't smoke. And thankfully, the consortium and a lot of researchers have done a lot to demonstrate the impact of radon, and we've had a lot of successes and policies to mitigate risk from radon, and can hopefully keep moving forward and making progress in that area. Asbestos is another risk factor. Radioactive ores such as uranium, inhaled chemicals such as arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, silica, vinyl chloride, nickel compounds, chromium compounds, coal products, mustard gas, and chloromethyl ethers, diesel exhaust, air pollution, and arsenic in drinking water. So a lot of environmental factors here with lung cancer. Again, here's our rate. Iowa in the yellow, coming down, thankfully, but a much lesser rate than the rest of the NCI SEER registries and the rest of the country. When we look at patterns of lung cancer in Iowa, we see in southern Iowa the highest incidence in general. That's partially reflective of smoking rates, so we see higher rates down there as well. And again, here's these newer maps that show incidence by zip code, and you can see some of the darkest red there in those bottom 3 tiers of Iowa counties, but also kind of spread throughout, but concentrated down in the south. Okay, then colorectal cancer. That's another one that's where, if you remember, we were not declining as fast as everybody else. It accounts for 8% of all cancer cases in Iowa. We are 8th. We are very traditionally in the top 10 for colorectal cancer incidence, but thankfully right in the middle of the pack for mortality, with our rate is decreasing. Screening rates have been slowly increasing. The pandemic didn't help that situation much, but hopefully we're getting back on track. The known risk factors for colorectal cancer are age, personal history, family history, genetic mutations, being overweight or obese, physically inactive, diet. It's a little more controversial, but some studies have suggested diets high in red meat, smoking, alcohol, and type 2 diabetes. What are listed as possible risk factors for colorectal cancer are night shift work and previous radiation treatment. So there weren't a lot of sort of official risk factors for colorectal cancer that related to the environment, but as you can imagine, anything sort of ingested going through your digestive tract could cause some exposures. So when I say known risk factors, those are the ones that are, non-controversial and that a lot of studies have agreed, but certainly other studies are in progress to look at environmental risk factors in colorectal cancer. And here's Iowa in the yellow, again coming down, the rest of the country in the blue. The trends are fairly similar. We just started from a higher place, but at least we're coming down. It does not appear to be getting wider. This is just showing the screening rate is just kind of slowly but surely been going up, which is great. Still have that goal of getting to 80%. And our incidence has been coming down in those over age 50. It is kind of creeping up a little bit in in the blue for incidence under age 50. And as most people know, that the screening guidelines have been lowered to age 45, but this is sort of mostly the unscreened population. As you can see, still much lower than our 50 plus population. This is the pattern of colorectal cancer in Iowa. Not a real clear pattern, tends to be a little more purple in the south and central, and tends to be a little bit higher sometimes in rural areas than urban. And some of that could be access. You all know that colonoscopies can actually remove problematic polyps before they ever turn into cancer. So it's one of the few screening tests that can help you avoid cancer altogether. So some of that can be sort of an access issue. There's not great access points down in southern Iowa, and there's nothing really below them in Missouri to help them. And when we look by zip code in the newer maps, you can still see some highly concentrated areas of higher colorectal cancer incidence rates down south, but also along the Missouri River here and even up into northwest Iowa. And melanoma, that's usually kind of right around number 5 for us. That 6% of all cases. Iowa was ranked 5th and is in the top 10 for highest rate of increase among all U.S. states at almost 3.5% average annual percentage change. Females ranked 4th and males ranked 8th. So it's one where there's like a little bit different differences between the sexes. Mortality were ranked 6th. Females ranked 5th and males 14th. The incidence tends to be higher in northern Iowa. I'll show some maps about that. And known risk factors are UV light exposure. That can be from the sun or from tanning beds, moles, people with fair skin, family history, personal history, weakened immune system, male gender, and some rare conditions. So this is one where we're going up, and Iowa's going up at a faster rate than the rest of the SEER registries. And this is completely opposite of something like lung cancer. Now we see the northern Iowa having the higher rates compared to the southern part of the state. And when we look at those maps by zip code, you can see a big concentration in northern Iowa. Also over here in, I guess that'd be sort of northeast-ish Iowa, and over here in northwest Iowa. So a lot of that tends to be sort of ancestral, like your skin, again, fairness and freckling and things like that. We tend to have fairer skinned people in some areas of northern Iowa, which could explain at least partially some of that. Okay, so how does Iowa's cancer incidence rate compare to other states if you remove the ones I've talked about now? Have we explained it? Have we figured it out? Are we now back in line once we take those out with the rest of the country? No. Now we're flat. We're not going up anymore once we've taken all of those out, but we're still not going down at a rate that the rest of the country is. There's still a gap and it's getting wider. So in the interest of time, I've sort of collapsed this. Again, my postdoc, Jason Semprini, made this very helpful set of graphs, and I'm going to kind of talk through them a little bit here. He included, hopefully you can see this okay on your screen, some of our neighbors, just to see how are we doing compared to some other agricultural states and neighbors, the other original SEER 9 registries, and the rest of the US. So again, this is kind of recapping what we've seen, that breast up here, breast and melanoma are ones where we're increasing quite a bit. But as is, some of the other benchmarks that we're looking at, prostate again is another one. 2 we haven't talked about though is the oropharyngeal cancer and liver cancer. And these are ones where we are our rate is increasing much more rapidly than the others, as you can see from these graphs, and where it's a solid as opposed to where it's sort of transparent. The solid indicating a statistically significant change, and the kind of transparent ones mean that it's not really a statistical change from 0. So to talk about those quickly, oropharyngeal cancer makes up about 3% of Iowa's cancer cases. We were ranked 2nd in the country in incidence, and last year we were 1st. Not sure what to make of dropping to 2nd, because that includes now the 2020 data point in the most recent 5 years of data, and that's just kind of a garbage data point because of COVID. We think there was a lot of delayed screenings and visits to the doctor, so sort of waiting until we get the full file of 2021 cases to really understand what likely was happening in that time period. We have the greatest average annual percent change in the US at 2.6%. And for this one, excuse me, known risk factors are tobacco, alcohol, HPV, age, excess body weight, poor nutrition, ultraviolet light when it comes to the lip, and genetic syndromes. Another one is liver cancer, 2% of cases in Iowa. ranks 39th, which is good. A lot of liver cancer is caused by viral hepatitis, hepatitis B and C, and Iowa has a fairly low rate compared to the rest of the country of hepatitis B and C. Although there is a recommendation, I think, nationally for everybody to start getting the hepatitis B vaccine. It used to be, I think, just healthcare workers or people that were working around bodily fluids of any kind were recommended to get that, but now they're making a recommendation that everybody gets it. So I realized that last time I went to the doctor, I'm right in the middle of a 3-part series of getting those. Problem is we have the 9th greatest average annual percent change in the US. So even though we're ranked pretty low, we're increasing at a pretty good clip compared to other states. So other risk factors besides hepatitis B and C are cirrhosis, inherited metabolic diseases, heavy alcohol use, tobacco use, obesity, type 2 diabetes. And now we get into some environmental ones. I don't say that word, aflatoxins, hopefully everybody out there is getting a good laugh who knows what those are. Apparently fungus that contaminates peanuts, wheat, soybeans, groundnuts, corn, rice, vinyl chloride, and thorium, and yes. And then also use of anabolic steroids is a risk factor for liver cancer. Okay, so those are the ones that were increasing more than our neighbors or the US in general. How about the ones, again, where we're not decreasing at the rate that everybody else is? So here's where some of the types of cancer that are associated sometimes with environmental factors are coming in a little bit more. Bladder, brain, leukemia, and then, excuse me, thyroid cancer. And you can see like in something like thyroid cancer, most of the other states around us or the US are statistically decreasing there, and we have a non-statistically significant increase in our thyroid cancer. Same with leukemia, similar with brain. And then we are declining in bladder, but not as much as the states around us or the US. Let's see, I'm having a hard time getting my slides to move there. Okay, so quickly to kind of recap on these, bladder cancer makes up about 5% of all of our cancer cases, and we're ranked 12th in incidence. Known risk factors for bladder cancer are smoking, arsenic in drinking water, age, chronic bladder infections, genetic and family history, personal history, workplace exposures, including industrial chemicals that are listed here, occupations including painters, machinists, printers, hairdressers, truck drivers. So quite a few different environmentally related risk factors for bladder cancer. Leukemia makes up 4% of all of our cancer cases. Iowa ranks 3rd. We're traditionally very high, unfortunately, in our ranking for leukemia. Risk factors here: smoking, radiation, exposure to benzene and Agent Orange, myelodysplastic syndromes, family history, and genetic syndromes and age. So again, some environmental risk factors that can come in with leukemia. Thyroid makes up about 3% of all of our cancer cases. Iowa ranks 18th. And the risk factors for that are age, hereditary conditions, family history, radiation treatment, imaging tests, being overweight or obese, and iodine in the diet. And then brain cancer, thankfully, is fairly rare, making up 1% of our cancer cases. We rank 12th. Known risk factors: radiation exposure, family history, and a weakened immune system. Possible risk factors listed with NCI or environmental factors such as exposure to vinyl chloride, a chemical used to manufacture plastics, petroleum products, and certain other chemicals have been linked with an increased risk of brain tumors in some studies. So it seems like there's a lot of research in that area examining environmental factors with brain cancer. And then just to show a graph of our pediatric cancers in Iowa, I get that question quite a bit. We were for quite a while higher than the rest of the country, and sort of looking into like what is accounting for this. We haven't had quite time to finish drilling down into this to figure out what is accounting for the decrease in pediatric cancers, but that's good news that we started to decrease, and those are no longer widening that gap there. So I just wanted to point out a lot of the information I got about environmentally related risk factors comes from the National Cancer Institute. They have a web page about cancer-causing substances in the environment. You can kind of drill down into those and what cancers they're associated with. And to summarize, some cancers in Iowa are rising and others are not falling as quickly as they are in other states. And both of those things are accounting for our incidence rates being off from the rest of the country. To reiterate, cancer is multifactorial, and there are many evidence-based ways to reduce our risk for cancer that we already know. And those are listed in the Iowa Cancer Plan that the Iowa Cancer Consortium has developed with all of their partners. I think Dr. Jacobs did a great job of really kind of focusing on a solutions-based approach and trying to figure out what we know now and what we can do about that now. We do know that Iowans have a number of environmental exposures that could contribute to our risk of cancer. Radon is a prime example, and many of these can be mitigated. And further studies are needed to determine the potential impact of environmental exposures on cancer in Iowa. We're working with a lot of our partners around the state, our colleagues in occupational environmental health, seeing if we can link data sets between our cancer incidence data sets and water quality, air quality, all kinds of different sort of exposures that are out there in data sets that we can link and really try and figure this out a little bit better and figure out if there's certain areas of the state or certain populations where we really need to target some efforts. But by and large, we already know lots of different ways to reduce our risk for cancer. As Dr. Jacobs said, it's kind of like you're trying to not fill in that last piece of the pie or whatever it is that's going to kind of convert you over to starting to develop cancer. And so really encourage everybody who hasn't had a chance to look at the Iowa Cancer Plan yet to do so, and really appreciate the work that you all do across the state in trying to keep our environmental risk to our health as low as possible. But we all know there's lots of work that needs to be done on that, and it would be great to dig into this a little bit more. So with that, I am happy to take questions.
Thanks, Mary. Okay, I'll start with the ones in the Q&A first. How do you account for cancer metastasis in this data? Is it based on the primary site?
That's correct. It would be listed under the primary site of cancer. We only track people. Basically, we register newly diagnosed cancer cases from distinct primary sites, and then we follow everybody in the registry until they die, so that we know if they're alive or dead at any given time. But we don't track metastatic sites specifically. So some cancers we do. There's variables where we can kind of capture that, but everything's listed as per the primary site.
And does the data from the registry incorporate the geographic area where a person has lived for most of their life? Like if you grew up in Northwest Iowa and moved and was diagnosed with cancer years later in Cedar Rapids, like how does that
Right.
work?
When we register those cases, it is at the time, the place they lived when they were diagnosed. We're doing lots of work, though, with the National Cancer Institute, LexisNexis, and some of those types of databases to create residential histories for people that would allow researchers to know how long they were at a residence for, or at least sort of have ranges of time. So that those are kind of works in progress to construct that for everybody. But the maps I'm showing and that we have available on our website are based on where the person lived at the time of their diagnosis, irrespective of how long they lived there or where they grew up or anything like that.
Are we doing a better job of defining who is required to report cancer?
I hope so. We have suggested some changes to the Iowa Administrative Code to make sure that it's clear who is required to report. We don't just only rely on hospitals anymore. So things, especially for things like melanoma or some of the urologic cancers, we know we really need to get into clinics. Some cancers are never treated in hospitals anymore, and some chemotherapeutic or immunotherapy agents are, distributed at a retail pharmacy and not necessarily infused. So we have a lot of targeted efforts to do that, and are kind of bringing on new reporting sources all the time.
And if we needed to focus on one cancer, what would you say that would be, and in what part of the state?
Oh boy, I don't I don't have an answer to that. I think hopefully you saw from all of the data that it's not one cancer and it's not one area. I think figuring out what's going on with breast cancer is important. It's also like the other sort of complexity of this and prioritizing cancers is how deadly are they? Again, we certainly don't want people going through cancer that can be prevented, but breast cancer is certainly not the most deadly cancer in Iowa. And so it sort of, unfortunately, I don't think we can make a dent in that trend by just focusing on one cancer in one area of the state.
Is it possible to quantify excess cancer diagnosis in Iowa compared to the national average? I.e., the number of Iowans diagnosed with cancer in 2023 who might not have if we had average cancer rates.
Yeah, we could certainly do that with these were all rates that I was showing. So per 100,000 people, we could sort of do the math on that, tell you how many more people in Iowa ended up with cancer than would have been if we had the same rate as the US. So we could certainly come up with that. Unfortunately, I can't do it on the fly here, but we could do that.
And one more from the chat. Why would a breast cancer survivor diagnosed in Iowa only be followed for about 15 years? Christine said she received letters yearly to report how she was, but hasn't received these letters in over 10 years.
Yes, we still do follow everybody. We just don't do it through that active letter writing process. That was sort of inefficient compared to linkages that we're able to do now. We're provided with death records from our partners at the Iowa Health and Human Services. We link to the National Death Index. We also link to the Social Security databases. We use the driver's license information to know like when somebody like renews and when we have a date when they were last alive. So we no longer need to do that for the most part. Some populations like the adolescent young adult populations that change their name and move around a little bit. We have to be a little bit more aggressive in finding them, but we can find you now without sending letters. So we've converted over to that method.
Is state funding for cancer research going up, down, or staying steady? And does one type of cancer receive more funding than others in Iowa?
State funding for cancer research. Well, I'm going to say that's pretty flat, pretty low and pretty flat right now. I think there's some pockets of appropriated money. I think melanoma maybe was one of those. But I do know there's an effort on the part of George Weiner and some other advocates to ask the state for a much larger pot of funds that can go to some different buckets of cancer research, including pediatrics and prevention and treatment types of studies. So I think that's in the works to ask for that. I think they maybe just need some help in finding some people to help champion that across the state.
And same question regarding federal funding to Iowa.
To Iowa. Well, that's a good question just because I don't know the through grant mechanisms, that we go after. I'm not sure if we're getting awarded more or less per grant application than other states or just the dollar amount per capita. I'm not sure. I would have to do some digging on that. But our funding for our registry is very stable. 80% of our funds to do cancer surveillance come from the NCI and 20% come from the University of Iowa. And then we do get a small amount from the state of Iowa to help with that. But I can't say overall federal research dollars that are allocated through grants. I'm not sure.
And I also want to leave space if anyone wants to unmute and ask a question. I know the chat isn't for everyone. So if folks want to unmute and ask, feel free. Molly is also here, not to put you on the spot, Molly, but Molly presented last week. So if anyone has anything brewing in their mind after listening to both presentations and would like to make any thoughts or comments or questions, please feel free to do that as well.
hopefully you all have a lot of questions brewing, a lot of things that you want to do to kind of take this to the next level. I hope. I really hope this just at least sort of level set like what the drivers are, and we're doing work every day to try and keep digging into this and keep coming up with more specific geographic areas or more specific types of cancer or more specific risk factors that where we think we could have the biggest impact. But again, hopefully I conveyed that it's not one thing here, and it's really going to take all of us. We're really lucky to have the Iowa Cancer Consortium with a really extensive and thorough plan. There's a lot we know on how to reduce our risk for cancer, and there's a lot we don't know. And I think again, it's going to take everyone here, and I really applaud the work that all of you do in all your different areas to kind of help figure this out and help figure out what we need to do, because there's not what I can't tell anybody is any good reason why Iowa is number 2. We don't have, our risk factors aren't that different from any other state, and in a lot of cases they're favorable. Our sociodemographic profile is good relative, if you think of states in the South. Often you look at any map of anything in health, and it's the states in the South that tend to have that higher rate. So I don't have a good explanation of why this is happening in Iowa. We're going to focus our next Cancer in Iowa report on alcohol-related cancers, mostly to build awareness, because I don't think a lot of people know. I think one study showed only 40% of the general US population knows that there's any link between alcohol and cancer. And that is one risk factor where Iowans unfortunately really excel and stand out, is our rate of binge drinking and the amount of alcohol that we consume. So that will be coming out in February. I think I saw somebody ask about cluster investigations come through.
Yes.
Yeah, always contact, reach out to us. We're happy to investigate any sort of concerns or curiosities about whether rates are higher in a certain part of the state than others. We work with a person who's ever reports the potential concern to figure out, what is the defined area that they're concerned about, and what are some comparable areas we can compare them to figure out if certain cancers make up a bigger mix than they should. What we are working on with some of our colleagues in environmental health and in biostatistics is to come up with a more systematic kind of algorithmic way to be constantly sort of mining and looking for hotspots of cancer in Iowa, so we can kind of more systematically look for those rather than waiting for a concerned citizen to report those. So that's something that we're working on.
Okay.
And we're also, sorry.
Yeah.
So
No,
we're also working with our friends at CHEEC, Center for Health Effects of Environmental Contamination. They've told us, where there's concerns about PFAS and nitrates in water supplies. And so we're kind of proactively starting to watch there to see if we can see any sort of signal with any different cancer types. But, cancer takes a long time to develop. So there's this kind of lag in between doing that. So some places it's been a problem for a long time, and we can look at that now. Other places where it's a newer kind of exposure, we'll have to kind of watch and wait to see what happens there.
I'm going to launch the post-session survey before folks start jumping off, since we've got 4 minutes, but feel free to answer that. And then I feel like you kind of answered Audrey's question about endocrine disrupting chemicals and future research, but someone did want to know how much of this information is specifically shared with the governor or lawmakers and the legislature. So
yeah, that's a great question. We're working on kind of boiling that down to the amount of information that could be digested by our busy policymakers. So we are working on getting that out to them, hopefully in time for the legislative session.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mary, and thank you so much, Molly, since you're on too. This has been a really awesome 101 webinar series, and I think it's been a great opportunity to just see the connections between cancer and the environment, whether we're learning about it for the first time or the 100th time, a really important topic. And in terms of the Cancer and the Environment Task Force, we're really looking forward to expanding the task force and covering topics that are important to folks like water quality and air quality. And so we're hoping that we can continue to do that next year. So everyone will be receiving the recordings for both presentations, as well as additional resources from both. So that'll be in a follow-up email. But if anyone has any final thoughts or questions before we sign off, feel free. Okay, yeah. So Environment Task Force information, I can include that in the follow-up email. The momentum has grown exponentially since the summer, and it's looking like it will probably be a work group. So if folks are interested in joining that, that will be in the follow-up email as well. You'll get information on upcoming meetings and presentations.